Lobster. For most of American history, lobster was considered so low class that servants negotiated contracts to limit how often their employers could force them to eat it. It was shoreline trash, fertilizer, the protein of last resort. At some point between then and now, it became the thing people save up to order on anniversaries. Lobster is a cold water crustacean that spends its life on the ocean floor eating whatever it finds down there. That fact alone explains a lot about its early reputation. Through the 1600s and 1700s, when massive piles of them washed ashore after storms along the New England and Atlantic Canadian coasts, settlers didn't think dinner, they thought problem. Farmers shoveled them into fields as fertilizer. Servants and prisoners ate them out of necessity, not preference. There's a story that people kept repeating about laws that actually limited how often you could feed lobster to prisoners because it was considered cruel and unusual punishment. Food historians have looked hard for those laws and never found them. But the story survives because it captures something real. This was a creature so associated with desperation that people needed a rule to explain how you could force it on someone. What changed everything wasn't the lobster, it was the railroad. When rail lines connected coastal New England to inland cities in the mid-1800s, people who had never seen a live lobster tried it for the first time in dining cars, prepared fresh and served as a novelty. Novelty became desirable. Desirable became expensive. Restaurants put them on white tablecloths, charged market price instead of a fixed number, and let diners invent their own meaning around the meal. In Australia, closely related crustaceans are still casually called bugs in everyday conversation. Moreton Bay bugs, Balmain bugs, names that survived because the sea insect reputation never fully went away there. The rest of the world just decided to forget it. Oxtail. It's the tail, the literal tail of the cow. Mostly bone, almost no meat, and for most of history, the last thing anyone wanted to pay for. Right now, it costs more per pound than a lot of steaks. Something happened and it wasn't the tail that changed. Oxtail is exactly what it sounds like, the skinned tail of cattle, cut into cross-sections. Each piece is mostly bone with a thin ring of meat and a layer of connective tissue around the outside. That connective tissue is collagen, but nobody used that language when oxtail was a peasant food. From the 17th century through most of the 20th, the description was simpler. It takes 3 hours of simmering to be edible, costs almost nothing, and fills a pot. Poor communities across the Caribbean, West Africa, and Europe turned it into thick, rich stews and soups, the kind of dishes that required more time than money. The Jamaican oxtail stew, the Korean kori gomtang, and the Italian coda alla vaccinara, none of these started as restaurant dishes. They started as ways to turn a throwaway cut into something worth eating. The collagen that made it such slow work is the same thing that makes it valuable now. When it breaks down during long cooking, it turns the braising liquid thick and glossy. In the 2000s and 2010s, chefs realized the result looked and tasted like something that should be expensive, even if the ingredient wasn't. Food media, social media, and tasting menus all started spotlighting oxtail at roughly the same time, and demand climbed faster than ranchers could keep up with. There is only one tail per animal. When suddenly everyone wants it, the price reflects that math. Caviar. American saloon owners used to put caviar out on the bar for free, not as a luxury, as a trick to make you drink more beer. It sat there next to the pretzels, and nobody was impressed. Caviar is salted, cured roe from sturgeon, the eggs, harvested and preserved. When people talk about real caviar, they mean sturgeon roe specifically. Salmon roe, trout roe, and other fish eggs get sold under similar names, but purists will tell you there's one original. In the 19th century, that distinction barely mattered in America because sturgeon were everywhere. The Delaware River, the Hudson, the rivers of the Pacific Northwest, all full of them. The roe was a cheap byproduct of fish processing, so salty and abundant that saloons put bowls of it out for free. The goal was to make people thirsty, because thirsty people order more rounds. Caviar was simply a marketing tool for selling beer. Overfishing, river damming, and industrial pollution gutted sturgeon populations across North America through the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and supply collapsed. Then came the rebranding, and it came specifically from European aristocracy. Russian czars and their courts had been treating Caspian sturgeon roe as a royal food for centuries, and that association got imported wholesale into American luxury marketing once the domestic supply dried up. Mother-of-pearl spoons became mandatory because metal supposedly affects the flavor. Blinis and creme fraiche also appeared as serving vessels. More recently, bumps, a small amount of caviar served directly on the back of your hand, became a part of serious caviar culture, a way to taste it without any interference. The ingredient didn't change, the scarcity did. And scarcity, paired with the right story, is all luxury has ever needed. Pork belly. Before it became a restaurant signature, pork belly was the fatty slab of pig that working-class households either hid inside sausages or boiled into submission because they couldn't afford to be picky. At some point, chefs started charging $40 for it and calling it indulgent. Pork belly is the underside of the pig, the same cut that becomes bacon when it's cured and smoked, or pancetta when it's rolled and salted in the Italian tradition. In its uncured form, it's a thick slab of layered fat and meat that requires serious cooking time to render properly. From the 19th century through most of the 20th, fatty cuts were what you ate when you couldn't afford lean ones. Industrial pork production treated belly as a commodity, traded on futures markets, processed into cheap products, rarely presented as something a restaurant would put at the center of a plate. Starting in the 1990s and accelerating through the 2000s, the nose-to-tail movement changed how pork belly was treated. A generation of chefs built a philosophy around using every part of the animal and presenting those parts with the same care as a prime cut. Pork belly became the case study. Slow roasted until the fat renders into something close to silk, then finished at high heat to crisp the skin. The technique turned a background ingredient into something chefs could plate beautifully. Oysters. New York City was once so overrun with oysters that they used the shells to pave roads, reinforce building foundations, and make lime for mortar. They were cheap filler, stuffed into pies and stews to stretch meals when meat was too expensive. Today, you pay several dollars for a single one on a bed of ice. Before industrial pollution and over-harvesting hit in the late 1800s, the oyster beds along the Atlantic coast were staggering in size. New York Harbor alone had an estimated 220,000 acres of oysters, the largest estuary oyster system in the world. Street vendors sold them by the bucket. Oyster sellers in 19th century New York served them to anyone who could spare a few cents, which was most people. The shells accumulated in heaps called middens, which archaeologists still find today. And those same shells got used as construction material, burned to make lime for plaster and mortar, crushed for road surfaces, and packed into foundations. Then the harbor filled with sewage. Over-harvesting gutted the beds. The oysters that remained became associated with contamination rather than abundance, and for a long stretch of the 20th century, eating a New York oyster was a legitimate health risk. But in the early 2000s, the raw bar regained popularity, and with it came an entirely new oyster vocabulary. Merroir, the coastal equivalent of wine's terroir. East Coast versus West Coast. The names of specific bays and inlets printed on menus like wine appellations. Oysters became something you discussed, paired with champagne, and photographed. The comeback required them to be scarce, clean, and carefully sourced. The opposite of everything that made them a peasant food in the first place. Short ribs. Short ribs used to require hours of slow cooking just to be chewable, which is exactly why they were cheap. Tough, bony, and time-consuming were not selling points. Somewhere along the way, restaurants decided that the hours of labor and the falling off the bone result were worth a premium price. And now, the same cut that was once thrown into weekday stews shows up as a $45 entree. Short ribs come from the lower portion of the rib cage, where the ribs connect to the breastbone. The meat is heavily marbled, wrapped around dense bone, and held together by thick bands of connective tissue. You can't grill them and call it done. The collagen needs time and moisture to break down, which means braising. Submerged in liquid at low heat for hours until the meat falls apart. Through the 18th, 19th, and most of the 20th centuries, that process was standard practice in households where expensive cuts were out of reach, and time was the only resource you had in abundance. By the late 1990s and into the 2000s, restaurants adopted them for the same reason chefs adopted oxtail and pork belly. The end result looks and tastes like luxury, even when the starting material wasn't. A properly braised short rib, lacquered, falling apart, served over a smooth puree with a reduced sauce pooled around it, photographs like something that should be expensive, and restaurants priced it accordingly. The labor involved in a 12-hour braise gave chefs justification to charge what prime cuts cost, even though the raw ingredient came from the bargain section. Brisket followed a similar path. So did hanger steak, which butchers used to keep for themselves because nobody else asked for it. Escargot. The reason French peasants ate snails had nothing to do with enjoying them. Snails were free. You could pull them out of ditches and hedges with your hands, and no one else wanted them. That's the entire origin story of one of the most recognizable items on a fine dining menu. Escargot is not a general term for any snail. The preparation requires specific species, most commonly the Burgundy snail or the petit gris, raised or harvested under controlled conditions. purged of their digestive contents over several days, cooked, removed from their shells, then baked back inside with garlic butter and parsley. What ends up on the plate is not something you could substitute with whatever is in your garden. For centuries before the restaurant era, stretching back through medieval Europe, rural communities across France and the Mediterranean gathered land snails as a protein source during lean seasons, during Lent when the Catholic Church restricted meat consumption, and during famines when there wasn't a choice. The snails cost nothing. Garlic, butter, and herbs made them edible. That combination of free ingredient plus flavorful fat is exactly how most peasant food becomes good food. The constraints force you to get clever. French restaurant culture in the 19th and 20th centuries absorbed this and repackaged it. Bistros and brasseries served escargot in specialized ceramic dishes with individual wells for each shell, accompanied by tongs and a tiny fork. The elaborate equipment signaled that this required expertise, which translated into price. Ordering escargot became a way to communicate that you were sophisticated, that you ate things other people wouldn't. Bone marrow. 100 years ago, you could walk into a butcher and get bones for almost nothing, sometimes free, because they were considered scrap. The marrow inside those bones now gets roasted, plated on a wooden board, and sent out as a starter at steakhouses with a price tag that would have baffled every person who ever used it to make soup. Bone marrow is the soft, fatty tissue that fills the hollow cavity inside large animal bones, primarily femur bones from cattle. It's made up largely of fat cells and connective tissue, and when roasted at high heat, it melts into a rich substance that spreads like soft butter. Historically, the bones went into the stock pot. For centuries, marrow enriched broths and soups in households where no part of an animal could be wasted, and the bones themselves cost almost nothing because nobody thought of them as food. They were the scaffolding left over after the actual meat was gone. The restaurant reinvention was relatively recent. In 1994, British chef Fergus Henderson opened St. John Restaurant in London and built his entire menu around using every part of the animal. Roasted bone marrow served with toast and parsley salad became the signature dish. Visually striking, cheap to produce, and the flavor was extraordinary enough to justify the theater. The food world took notice fast. By the 2000s, steakhouses on both sides of the Atlantic were charging $15 to $20 for a starter made from the same bones that butchers use to shovel into bags for stock. Sushi. There are omakase restaurants in New York and Los Angeles where you sit at a counter, eat whatever the chef decides to serve you, and leave $200 to $300 lighter per person. The food those chefs are working with started as the fastest, cheapest street food in 19th century Tokyo. Workers ate it standing up between jobs because they didn't have time to sit down. Sushi is not simply raw fish. The defining element is the rice. Short-grain rice seasoned with vinegar, salt, and sugar, prepared to a specific temperature and texture before anything else happens. Early forms of sushi were preservation techniques. Fish packed with fermented rice and left for months. In those original versions, the rice was discarded after doing its job. Only the fish was eaten. By the Edo period in Japan, around the 17th through 19th centuries, the process had evolved into quick, hand-pressed nigiri sold at outdoor stalls. A piece of seasoned rice with a slice of fish pressed on top, made in seconds, eaten immediately. Fast food in the most literal sense. The modern split between cheap and luxury sushi is wide enough that they barely resemble the same thing. Conveyor belts, supermarket trays, and casual rolls represent one end. Omakase, which translates literally as "I'll leave it up to you," represents the other. At an omakase counter, there is no menu. You sit, often with 10 to 12 other diners, and the chef sends out a sequence of pieces chosen based on what arrived from the fish market that morning. The fish is frequently flown in overnight from Tokyo's Toyosu market. The rice temperature is monitored. There is a correct way to eat each piece and an understood etiquette about when to talk and when not to. Prices in major American cities typically run $150 to $300 per person, and reservations at the most sought-after spots require booking weeks in advance. Foie gras. Foie gras is currently banned in California, New York City, and several countries. It's also one of the most expensive items on Michelin-starred menus around the world. What almost nobody tells you is that it didn't start in a French kitchen. It started with people who couldn't afford to waste any part of the bird they were already eating, and figured out that the fatty liver, prepared right, was actually extraordinary. Foie gras is the liver of a duck or goose that has been enlarged through a feeding process called gavage, force feeding to produce a liver that can be up to 10 times its normal size. The practice is ancient. Murals in Egyptian tombs from around 2500 BC show geese being hand-fed. What's less discussed is why ordinary people, not royalty, not aristocrats, were doing this in the first place. In parts of Europe from the medieval period onward, particularly among Jewish communities in France and Alsace, geese were raised primarily for their fat, which served as a cooking substitute for lard and butter in a kosher kitchen. The enlarged liver was the byproduct of that process, an organ that came out of an animal already being used to its fullest. Using it wasn't decadence, it was efficiency. Peasant and small farm logic demanded that nothing go to waste, and someone figured out early that a properly cooked fatty liver was something remarkable. By the 18th and 19th centuries, French haute cuisine, the formal restaurant-based cooking tradition that defined European fine dining, had absorbed that knowledge and rebuilt it as luxury. Pâtés in decorated terrines, sliced and seared, served in small portions with brioche and fig jam at prices that put it firmly in special occasion territory. The controversy made it more desired in certain circles. A banned ingredient carries a particular status among diners who measure sophistication by willingness to eat things other people won't. Indulging in luxury food items can be a memorable experience, but sometimes you just want something cheap and covered in sugar. Be sure to check out our video, Every Type of Donut Explained.